We're really lucky to have the curator Ben Paites here with us tonight to tell us a bit more about the Roman Colchester and the Boudiccan rebellion. So just quickly, I want to just remind everyone that this session is going to be recorded. So if you'd prefer, you can turn off your cameras now, and we're going to share that recording online on our training page. And there'll be time for questions at the end. So either save your questions and you can ask them, or pop them in the chat, and we can give them to Ben at the very end. But I think, yeah, that's enough from me, and I'll hand over to you now. So thanks so much. Here you go.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the slides that I'm sharing. That's slow. There we go. So, yes, thank you for inviting me along this evening to talk to you all about Roman Colchester and its history. Colchester has a very long history that goes far back beyond the Roman period, and I will be touching a little bit on its early origins because they have a huge impact on what the city would later become. But I also will be kind of mainly focusing on objects, because that's one of the big things that we as museums are kind of here for, is we tell stories through objects. That's how I like to see museums. So it will be a very object focused talk. And then right at the end, I will be looking at some of our inscriptions from the museum's collection from Colchester, because I know we're all Latinists here, or at least we're all kind of interested in classics and language and telling history through lots of different ways. So I will be looking at some of the inscriptions that we have in our collection and what they tell us about the people who lived in Colchester around 2,000 years ago through their own voices. So I start with looking at the Iron Age. So we talk about the Iron Age as the period before the Romans arrived here in Britain. Historical periods in general, I'm an archaeologist by training. Let me just say historical periods are basically all made up. People have chosen arbitrary dates to decide when a certain period ended and started. But the Iron Age is sort of the period before the Romans arrived. But of course, the people living in Britain at the time, before the Romans arrived, would have continued to some extent living the life the same as they had, and would have had the same cultures and customs and traditions, and they persisted well into what we consider the Roman period. So some of those things we will have a look at today. But I also wanted to start with thinking about some of the preconceptions we have about the people before the Romans, so pre-Roman Colchester, for example. And I've got this image, which is your pretty stereotypical image of the Iron Age, what people think of. This is supposedly a reconstruction of what Colchester was like before the Romans arrived. And some of the things we often think of are that it's a world of brown and green, very dark, dirty colours, very earthy. It's a poor society, resistant to foreign influence. There was resistance to the Romans, as we know through historical records and other sources, which I will speak about today. And it's unclean. They're always depicted as dirty, as unwashed, as people who aren't interested in hygiene. Basically, they are agricultural people living in, at least right at the cusp of the Roman invasion. They are living in kind of sort of fortified towns, in these round houses made of mud and animal poo and all sorts of kind of these ideas of barbarianism and uncivilized lifestyles. But I'm going to question that, and I'm going to say, was that actually the case? Were the people of Iron Age Britain really all these things? And we need to remember as well, when we're looking at these ideals, is that actually the sources that we get this information from primarily are from Roman sources. And so, of course, the Romans are going to have their own views about what the Iron Age people were like. But more than that, a lot of the views we have today come from Victorian 20th century historians, because they've had a look at the past, they've read sources, and they've made their own interpretations and understandings of what life would have been like back then. And a lot of the time, those ideas and beliefs were based on British imperialism. Romans were part of an empire. Britain was part of an empire. And so often when you look at these historical texts from that period, there's often an attempt to compare those two. And actually, sometimes that doesn't work. And I will be touching on some of the ways in which that doesn't work in practice. But when we're looking at this period in Roman history, it's quite a complex period, and we'll see about that in a second. So, are all of these things true? No, it was a world of color in the Iron Age. And we have a lot of sources to prove that, both archaeologically and kind of literary. Um, some from Britain and some from other places. So I'm going to start with the object on the right, which is the old Holdermoser Cape, which comes from Denmark, I believe, which was during the Iron Age. So this is the same time period as we have in Britain that we're looking at, just before the Romans arrived, or at least kind of around that time. And as you can see, when it first comes comes out of the ground, this is a very well preserved piece of textile, because textile usually doesn't survive through thousands of years in the ground. This was found in a very waterlogged deposit, so the water acts as a way of preserving a lot of organic materials. And although it's not as bright now, it would have been a bright yellow, and kind of, we know from, as you can see next to it, from other sources that we have, that other usually quite natural dyes were used to color fabrics and textiles at that time. So the bright yellow would have been like we've got at the top image, the yellow and blue. And there were a whole host of different colors that the people in the Iron Age were able to use to color their clothing: reds, greens, blues, and quite bright, vibrant colors. So it wouldn't have been dark browns and greens. It could have been all sorts of colors. The other issue we have with archaeology sometimes, like with the Holdermoser Cape, is that the stuff that we have today that survived is a bit grotty, is a bit dirty, has faded, has oxidized, has changed its color, and so doesn't quite look how it looked. The classic example being Roman statues, all marble. Everyone thinks, oh, the Romans loved white. White's everywhere. They had everything made of marble and it was all white. Actually, a lot of those statues were painted. They were bright, colorful, painted sculptures, and looked completely different during Roman times than they do to us today, sitting in museums. And similarly, with objects like the one on the left, which is an Iron Age toggle, it would have been much more bright. The copper, which is now a dark rusted color, would have been bright copper. And the enamel that's set into it would have been a bright red glass. So the objects we see in museums, the objects we see that survive to today, do sometimes look different to what they would have looked like back in the past, and of course give us a completely different perception of what those people might have looked like back then. The Iron Age world was full of trade, full of connections to Europe, full of kind of communication in various different ways, not necessarily speaking the same languages always, but they were definitely connected to lots of different people across Europe at least. And all of these objects we have on here were found from burials during the Iron Age. So they were before AD 43, which we traditionally consider to be the start of the Roman period, with Claudius's invasion of Britain. But all of these are objects that have come from the continent. On the left, we have a lovely griffin mount, probably from a vessel of some sort, maybe kind of a kitchen vessel of some sort, which was definitely made, much like the boar figurine, was made in Gaul. We have the medallion of Augustus, which is actually made from a Roman coin. So they've repurposed a Roman coin to make this medallion with Augustus's face on. Although I can't imagine many hardcore Romans would have wanted to reuse coinage in that way. They're clearly, the person who was in this grave, buried with this object, clearly either they or the loved ones burying them had some connection to the Roman world and wanted to show this Romanness in that burial, and so used this image of Augustus to kind of express that connected to that person. We have gold, and sort of going back to the last slide about color, they weren't kind of poor. They had bright kind of materials of all sorts of different types. Gold probably at this time is coming from Wales or Ireland, so it's not too far away, but it's still coming from somewhere else. But this again was found in a burial, so these gold threads were found inside a burial from Colchester. And the amphora, the one I have there on the right, actually loads of burials, relatively loads anyway, from the late Iron Age are found with Roman vessels of various types, whether they're amphora, flagons, all sorts of different things. So we know there was trade going on with the Roman world. We know that they were probably trading for their contents. So that's going to be olive oil, wine, things like that. So there was some sort of cultural exchange happening in Britain before the Romans officially arrived in AD 43. So they weren't, going back to my original point, they weren't averse to foreign influence or foreign exchange. They were very open to trading with people from the continent. And beauty and hygiene. So mirrors exist in the Iron Age. People clearly had a sense of self. People clearly had a sense of personal appearance. And so they would have been taking care of themselves, bathing, washing, cleaning. The Romans obviously brought the baths, the thermae, the kind of public, kind of formal bathing houses. And we don't really know how the Iron Age people would have bathed. There's kind of those traditional ideas of, well, they went down to rivers and washed themselves there. Maybe they did have some sort of bathing system. Maybe they did use vessels to bathe themselves in. We don't really know. There's not that evidence. And again, the Roman sources don't really talk about it that much. So we're not really sure. But the fact that they had these mirrors says to us that they clearly had some sense of personal appearance and wanted to make an effort to make sure they looked presentable. Then top right, we have, they're called woad grinders sometimes, but they're just generically cosmetic grinders. And they do occur in the Roman period as well as the Iron Age, but we have them in the Iron Age. So people were clearly grinding pigments to apply to the face as a way of basically makeup. I'm going to use modern terminology. I try not to use modern terminology when talking about the past because it's hard to compare directly, but it's effectively makeup. And they were using this in different ways. We know that some Iron Age people before battle would cover themselves in paint, the woad, and different things. But perhaps they would have covered themselves to kind of go out on social occasions for various other reasons, for feasts, for other things. We don't know. The main issue we have is, unlike with the Romans, we don't have portraiture, we don't have sculpture, we don't have things really that depict the Iron Age people visually represented. We have written descriptions from the Romans, which gives a certain perspective. But objects that we find like this suggest to us that maybe there was something else going on. Maybe they were taking a bit more care with their personal appearance. And then we have things like the doctor's grave. So the doctor's grave is an interesting hybrid assemblage. We have some Roman objects and we have some kind of clear practices that are considered to be kind of Iron Age. Sometimes this grave is referred to as the Druid's grave. So if you kind of read about it in books and things, sometimes they call it the Druid's grave. And I think that is because of this idea that they were kind of someone who clearly had a lot of Roman influence because of the sheer quantity of Roman stuff in that burial. But they also were practicing non-Roman medicinal practices. There is a strainer bowl in the bottom left, which would have been used for infusions of herbs and spices and things for various medical kind of practices. You had surgical tools, so they did practice kind of what would have been considered Roman practices of surgical, not like our modern day surgery, but kind of practices of surgical procedures. But they also had divination rods. So there was an element of the religious with these practices, as was the case with a lot of Roman medical practice. There was an element of combination of investigation and medicine alongside prayer and sacrifice when it comes to trying to heal from a variety of ailments. But we think that perhaps this person was an indigenous Iron Age person. You may notice I'm avoiding the word Celt because we try not to use that word too much because it's a much more complicated term. But a traditional indigenous Iron Age person who had been heavily influenced by the Romans. So that influence may be the reason why there was this kind of peak at the late Iron Age of interest in hygiene and personal adornment, stuff like that. Could be, but perhaps this was something that existed long before and we just don't have the evidence to show for it. So moving on. We in Colchester, some of you may have never been here before, so there's a little map to kind of show you where we are. London, which most of you should know, we are kind of northeast of London, and St Albans is just to the northwest, slightly nearer to London. This, as you can imagine, will be much more relevant a bit later on. But the Roman town of Colchester is essentially kind of next to what we think was a Iron Age settlement. The Iron Age settlements in this area are a bit complicated. The black marks on the map to the right are all ditches and banks. So this is the kind of network of enclosures and kind of fortifications, in a sense, that were built in the Iron Age right at the end of the Iron Age. And we have two key areas where we think the Iron Age kind of people were settled. One is Sheepen, which is right next to the Roman town and fort that you can see on the map, and one is down at Gosbex, which we think is the main Iron Age settlement. And we think that is probably the area that would be considered as the capital at that time in the Iron Age, the kind of main settlement for the region. So, but they all quite close together. And what you can see as well is they are in between these two rivers, which again, you can see a bit more clearly on this kind of heat map, that you can see the river to the north and to the south, the River Colne, which is where the town gets its name, and Roman River, which of course wasn't called the Roman River in Roman times, much more modern name. But the Roman town is right next to the river, and the original Iron Age settlement is much closer to the other river. So it sort of makes sense that they are located where they are, because most towns are built near rivers because of trade and fishing and a lot of other reasons. So initially, there was a fort built at the site next to the smaller Iron Age settlement to the north along the River Colne. This was to house the soldiers that arrived here in AD 43. The reason I've put the skull symbol rather than an image is trying not to use images of human remains in my presentations, but we do have skulls in our museum collection that come from the area just along what's called Boudiccan Hill to the west of the fort. And these skulls have traces of trauma at the back of the head, so clearly they met a violent end. And they also were decapitated, so there's evidence the spines were severed. And this sort of adds to some of the historical record evidence that suggests that what was going on at that time in the early period in the Roman conquest was that any people who resisted the Romans were executed and their heads were put on spikes around the fort to deter other local people from resisting Roman rule. So it's quite unusual to kind of get this quite direct evidence of this vicious activity that was going on. And we know then that in those early years there was resistance. There were a lot of people who weren't happy with Roman rule, even though there had been a good few decades of trade, communication, coexistence, sort of, before the official Roman conquest in AD 43. But these skulls act as a marker that there was something more sinister going on at that time. And it will get worse, and we will touch upon that in a bit. But the Roman military presence was pervasive throughout the Roman period. There was not really a point where there wasn't threat of another group of people invading or of rebellion within the ranks of the people living in Britain at that time. So although in the early stages it was a fort, it did develop into a civilian town here in Colchester, but there was always some element of a military presence, and sometimes that presence was slightly outside of the town instead, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. But then after the fort, they expanded, and we start to see some of the typical Roman features of a town. You will spot on one of the maps, not both of them, or the illustrations, one of them, there is an amphitheatre. Now, we don't know if there was an amphitheatre here in Colchester. There probably was, because pretty much every town had an amphitheatre. Gladiatorial combat was one of the major sources of entertainment throughout the Roman period, but it's just never been found. And one of the reasons for that is simply due to the fact that Colchester is still a densely populated area. The only way you'd really get to find an amphitheatre is by knocking down and excavating some of the current buildings that exist in the town. That doesn't happen very often. They did it, sadly, they did it quite a lot in the Victorian period, but they never found anything then. Our beautiful medieval town hall was knocked down in the Victorian period, and we now have a modern red brick monstrosity. But there have been no traces of an amphitheatre found so far. Philip Crummy, who was the former head of the Colchester Archaeological Trust, believes he knows where it is. I don't think he'll tell anyone, but he thinks he knows where it is and hopes to one day, despite having retired, probably find it. But until then, we don't know if there even was an amphitheatre. We have other ideas. of what might have been going on if there were gladiatorial combat here in Colchester. We think there probably was, because we do have a lot of gladiatorial objects, but it's something that eludes us and is a problem in a lot of built up towns and cities across everywhere really, that has had this long, deep history, is that unless you can get underneath the current buildings, there's no way of finding for certain everything that would have existed in those towns. So we do have some traces of the early Roman town, or at least the town in the 1st century, in Colchester still. They were kind of adapted and developed and things. So the Roman wall, a lot of that still survives. At least there is a wall following the route of what was the Roman wall around the town. In the medieval period, there are a lot of additions and kind of things added and reinforced. There were a few bastions added in the medieval period as well around the town. But for the most part, it's kind of what it was at that time. And this image that we have here, on the left is the illustration of what it would look like. This is the Boudiccan Gate, which is the western gate into the town. And here's what is left today. So 2 of the arches that you can still see. It's right near the Mercury Theatre, which was named after one of the objects that's in Colchester museums. But you can see this kind of grand entrance that you would have had to walk through to get into Colchester 2,000 years ago. And it, as I say, it persisted throughout the Roman presence in Colchester. So nearly 400 years, well, probably close to 300, but 300 to 400 years, you would have had this huge wall surrounding the town and these gates positioned at different points. And the Boudiccan Gate is the best surviving example of those that we have. And the Roman wall in Colchester is the oldest surviving wall in Britain as well. So it was one of the earliest walls to be built around a town. So one of the things to kind of think about in Colchester is, what do we have that other towns do and don't? Now, I talked about the amphitheatres that we may or may not have had. We're not really sure. I didn't put it on this list. I probably should have done, actually. We do have a circus, the Roman circus, which is to the south of the town, which is where chariot races would have happened. So one of the arguments is that perhaps that's where gladiatorial fights happened, in the circus instead. But again, we're not really sure. But we do know that there would have been chariot races happening there. So in Colchester, we do have evidence of a forum. We don't have direct evidence of a basilica, but it's likely that there would have been one because of the connection to the forum. Temples, we have a few. It's not just the one, but I will talk about those in a second. A curia, we don't have any evidence of a curia. It's very difficult to know if a building is a curia unless it says this is the curia on the outside, because unlike some of the other ones, there's not really a kind of set structure that they would have kind of been like. And then we have baths. So there would have been private baths, public baths. We have evidence of lots of different types of baths here in Colchester. So just going through some of these, and that lovely illustration, of course, is the theatre, which we also have, which for some reason I didn't put on the list. But yeah, there is a theatre that's kind of just to the west of where actually Colchester Museums is today. And if you go to the street where the theatre was, in the pavement, there is a curved line that marks where the theatre would have been. So you can see where the theatre is marked if you visit. So the forum, the very dodgy black and white photo, is a photo of the excavations of the forum that happened. I'm not even sure when. It was very, very long time ago. But the reconstruction you can see on the left, the forum is the kind of marketplace, the place of trading, public interaction, commerce, all those sorts of things. And you can see in the image on the right that it was just below this big temple. Now, this big temple is the Temple of Claudius. And that is where Colchester Castle Museum currently stands. So Colchester Castle Museum, the castle, that is the Norman castle that was built in the 1070s, was built on top of the foundations of what was the Temple of Claudius. But yeah, the forum, I'll talk about that in a minute. The forum is just to the south of that. And yeah, we have a little bit of evidence of forum existing in this area. And of course, we can then infer maybe that the basilica was somewhere nearby as well. So in this illustration, someone's put it even further to the south to kind of mirror where the enclosure around the Temple of Claudius was. But again, as I said, we don't actually physically have the evidence for this. It's probably in that area, but we can only guess. It's likely that there would have been one because this is the kind of judiciary, kind of legal building within the town that would have had some significance, and pretty much every Roman town would have had one in some form. But again, just haven't found evidence of one. Temples, as I mentioned, we have the Temple of Claudius in the centre, and this reconstruction on the left is in Colchester Castle Museum. You can see how it might have originally looked. And the temple on the right is actually outside of the town. So down in Gosbecks, the Iron Age settlement that we saw earlier on, that completely changed in the Roman period. You have a theatre and a temple and a sort of mini settlement building in that area. We think probably this was a temple to Mercury, mainly because there was a sculpture of Mercury found in that area, and there's a few objects and things related to Mercury that have been found in the surrounding areas. And it would make sense because this is sort of on the way from Colchester to London, which would have been a very active route throughout the Roman period. So lots of people would have wanted to make offerings to Mercury as they journeyed between those two towns. But much like with a curia, we don't have a sign saying this was the temple. So we have to make a lot of assumptions about some of these things. But there have been traces of other temples at Stanway and a few other places that kind of suggests that, as in any Roman town, there would have probably been multiple temples to multiple different gods serving different purposes. As I said, curia hasn't currently been found. This is the curia in Rome. Very, very grand building. Wouldn't have been like that in Britain, I'm sure. But like I say, we don't really have a kind of format or a plan for necessarily what these curia would have been like in Britain. So it's difficult to identify where those buildings were anyway. And then baths. So this is a lovely archaeologist down the hole, which is quite a common sight in Colchester because there are excavations going on all the time. This is actually in what is now a sort of, I was going to call it a pub. It's not quite a pub. It's sort of like a brew house. It's kind of, they do beers and gins and all sorts of different things. But they extended their property a couple of years ago. And when they were extending it, they did some excavations and they found what they thought might have been the public baths. So they went very deep, as you can see, and they found features that looked like sunken features that could have been baths for a bathhouse. But sadly, due to the kind of limitations of the excavation, they couldn't really excavate a large enough area to know for certain whether it was A, definitely a bathhouse, or whether it was something else, and B, whether it was a sunken feature of something else, or to the extent to which the bathhouse might have been. Because again, these baths are kind of variable sizes. You go to some of the ones in places like Pompeii, they were quite kind of, you have the different rooms and kind of things, and you have some places where they have male and female baths. But it's so variable that in Britain, again, where there's a very different setup to what was going on the continent, it might have looked slightly different. But we do have evidence of more private bathhouses connected to some of the townhouses in other areas of Colchester. So we know that wealthier residents of the town would have been bathing in their own properties. But it's likely that there would have been a public bath somewhere. And we think it's probably in the area, as I indicate on the map. That was where the excavations took place. Again, near the temple and the forum, which is a sensible place to be because it's a large public area. So we have to kind of guess a little bit about what it might have been like. So now I move on to Boudicca. So of course the town had developed and all of these things were built, and then all of that changed. Boudicca wasn't the only rebellion that happened in Britain, I will add. There were various rebellions that would have taken place throughout the nearly 400 years of Roman occupation, but easily Boudicca is the most memorable within modern kind of thinking, as you can see by the many, many depictions I found on Google of Boudicca. So these aren't museum collection images, these are just from Google, but I wanted to kind of show how many different ways the warrior queen has been shown in art, in media, in a lot of different things. So what do we actually know about Boudicca? Well, we have three literary sources, three direct literary sources that kind of mention Boudicca, two of which are from Tacitus. And there are kind of elements that directly link to Colchester. So Colchester gets a shout out in the annals. So this is the description of the kind of sculpture of victory that apparently fell and turned its back on the city when Boudicca's army was heading towards Colchester. And I only noticed this really, or even thought about this recently. We still have a statue of Victory in Colchester on the War Memorial. Now, I don't know whether that was an image chosen to connect it to the Roman story or whether it's just coincidence, but I found it quite interesting that still 2,000 years later, despite Victory having turned her back on the city, she somehow returned, and we have her with her back to the castle, sadly, but kind of defending the town to this day. Then in the Agricola, Tacitus again mentions Boudicca and kind of talks about the kind of attack on Colchester and other places. He kind of more talks about who Boudicca was and the fact that she was he was so surprised that she was kind of a leader of the people, because it says even but they don't even discern their rulers by sex. So this idea that women could lead as well as men. The fact that he mentions that, again, talks to Roman sensibilities about what women can do and what men can do. So the fact that Boudicca was leading this rebellion was an absolute shock to Tacitus. And then we have Cassius Dio, who was writing quite a bit later in Greek, and kind of, again, kind of talks about her and her appearance and how kind of large of stature she was and how imposing she must have been as a figure to meet on the battlefield. But this isn't a lot, really. When we think of a lot of historical figures and the number of sources you might have about them from roughly the same time period, this isn't a huge amount. So we have to kind of make a lot of assumptions. And there are some conflicting kind of elements within the story too. So the evidence we do have is archaeological as well. We have on the left, you can see the Boudiccan destruction horizon, which is this lovely line of black earth that runs throughout Colchester. It's also found in London and St Albans, because those are the other towns she completely burned to the ground. You find objects that are burnt and that have this evidence of destruction, whether that's the Samenware bowl at the top, all of these burnt objects at the bottom, and the absolutely incredible Fenwick treasure that was found in, I think, 2014 during excavations of the Fenwick department store in Colchester, which is a whole story in and of itself, which maybe I'll come back one day and talk about that. But it's a beautiful collection of objects that was found preserved that dates exactly as the point of the Boudiccan destruction, because it was found just at that layer of the Boudiccan destruction horizon. So it tells a beautiful story of these individuals who sadly lost their lives because they never returned to collect their objects. But we do have a few red herrings when it comes to Boudicca as well when we're looking at the history. So a few years ago in Cirencester, they found a tombstone that they thought was Boudicca's tombstone. It's Boudicca, which is very similar, but not quite the same. But it does tell us that those sorts of names existed in Britain. She wouldn't have been the only Boudicca going around. So again, some of the stories that may have circulated about a Boudicca, was it one woman? Was there more than one person with that name who did similar kind of things? It was clearly a name that kind of women at that time had. And again, it kind of ties into this idea of the mythologizing that happened in more recent years in the Victorian period and later around Boudicca and who she was, especially with Queen Victoria, who absolutely idolized Boudicca and sort of saw a kindred spirit in Boudicca as a powerful female leader with a very similar name, because Boudicca supposedly in kind of the language of those people meant victory, or was kind of related to victory, and Victoria of course means victory. So she saw a very strong connection with Boudicca. The idea that she was buried under King's Cross, I mean, we don't know where she died. We don't know if she died after the battle at Watling Street. We're not really sure what happened to her afterwards. The classic kind of Roman thing of once she was no longer a problem, they just stopped talking about her. So we're not really sure what ended up with Boudicca. She may have gone somewhere else entirely, but somehow their legend is that she was buried where King's Cross is. And also, not everything burnt was because of Boudicca. So you get burnt stuff in the archaeological record all the time, but only if it's found in that kind of destruction layer do we know that it happened in the Boudiccan event. And things like this lovely assemblage, you can see the eye and the face right in the center. This is actually a bed or a couch made of bone that was part of a grave, and the grave was part of the burial was a cremation. So this couch was burnt as part of the cremation process rather than any sort of attack on the town. So it's slightly different. So not all burning was Boudiccan. So life after Boudiccan, I'm going to realize we're kind of getting through through the time quite quickly. I'm going to kind of very quickly go through these because I've got one final section I want to kind of talk about before we have any questions. But there was a kind of, after Boudicca destroyed the town, it wasn't fully destroyed. People came back and it flourished. There was a boom in kind of industry, domestic life. So we find all these beautiful array of objects throughout the Roman period. It clearly had an important place, Colchester, in Britain. Although it stopped being the capital, so it started off as the capital of Britain administratively anyway, it stopped being a capital and London became the capital, but it still was clearly hugely important by the wealth of the objects that we find in Colchester. So the reason I've got this from the Stabian Baths is the foot here, the harpy foot, that is in our collection, was found in Colchester and would have been a foot of something a bit like this that you have in the Stabian Baths. And the harpy is quite a classic symbol on these feet with these lion kind of paws. We have industry, we have bone working industry happening over in Gosbecks that I mentioned about before, Samian ware production, or not Samian ware specifically, but Samian style ware that was being produced here in Colchester. Glass, recycling glass industry. We have the most prolific lamp factory in the country. So even in London, you're more likely to find Colchester-made lamps than London-made lamps. So when they started making their own lamps in London, they still preferred the Colchester ones. So we had this big industry of lamp making here at the time. The town is surrounded by burial and cemeteries, and we have a wealth of evidence from that period of a whole range of different practices going on. This lovely tile tomb on the right with the face pot, and that we didn't actually light that lamp. That is Photoshop, so don't worry, we're not burning our objects. But the face pot is a beautiful object. We have quite a lot of face pots in our collection. One of the highest numbers of face pots, again, in museum collections. We think that it's connected to an industry going on in the Rhine in Germany that was then brought over to Britain. But we have quite a lot of these, and they were cremation containers. So they had cremated remains of people inside them. And the Colchester vase in the centre, I'm going to talk about a bit more in a second, so I'll leave that one for now. But then the Sphinx and the cult of the disembodied head is actually something that comes from the Iron Age. This idea of heads is something you see a lot in Iron Age art and Iron Age decoration, and it then seems to get merged with Roman symbolism. So the Sphinx that we have here is kind of this blending of Iron Age and Roman practices. And in death, people are blending these traditions and symbols to kind of create these new identities here in Britain. And we have a lovely little bear, jet bear, that was found in a child's grave, possibly as a kind of protective symbol for into the afterlife. Religion, so the Gosbecks Mercury on the right, arguably one of the greatest pieces of classical sculpture in Britain, was found at Gosbecks, which is why we think that temple there was the Temple of Mercury. But we have a lot of evidence of religious practice in the town, from mini shrines and altars, probably from household larvaria, to these votive offerings that are found in different places as well on the left. Army, as I said, military presence the entire time. We get these tiny military fittings that were parts of scale armor, and these beautifully decorated scabbards and kind of other things that were clearly for more ceremonial purposes. But there was clearly a military presence in some form or another throughout the entire 400 years that the Romans were, roughly 400 years that the Romans were here in Colchester. So before we finish and take some questions, I'm going to quickly run through a few of the inscriptions that we have in our collection to show the ways in which Latin can be taught through objects, not just through texts and sources. So the first is the rude one. I did mention there'd be a rude one in the publicity. So you might not be able to read this because it's Latin cursive, which is notoriously horrendous. Even when I highlight it, it's probably really difficult to read because it's not very clear. But the inscription says cacas, which means you are shitting. And we think this comes from a Roman toilet. And someone wrote it there as a message for whoever the next attendant would be, as a little kind of silly toilet joke. So again, toilet humor kind of has persisted throughout the centuries. It's not just something we do today. Talking to the gods. So one of the things that the Romans did within their religion is talk directly to the gods, and this was through votive offerings, and these were often through inscriptions on plaques of various different materials depending on your wealth. So on the left we have a lead tablet, and on the right we have a bronze tablet. So the left one is an account of someone who had some stolen property and wanted revenge. That's quite a common thing that comes up in these plaques. And they're specifically kind of asking for the kind of blood payment for the person who stole. It doesn't actually specify what was stolen, but something was stolen from the person. It must have been very valuable to them. And that they would offer gifts to Mercury and virtue if the kind of punishment was given to the person that stole these objects. And then similarly, we have things that are kind of afterwards. So that first one was asking them for help, and this one is clearly they believe the god has given them some help. So they give this votive plaque as fulfillment of their vow. So what would have happened is the coppersmith Quintusmus would have said, please, Silvanus Calirius, can you do this thing for me? That thing happened. And then they said, great, job done. I will give you a votive plaque in thanks for the god's help. And we have quite a few to different gods of these type of plaque that have been found in Colchester. Remembering the dead. So I said there's a big funerary tradition here in Colchester, a lot of different formats, but the notion of Latin inscriptions on a tombstone with these sorts of images are found across the Roman Empire, really. So the first one we have is Longinus. Longinus is a great example of the movability of people in the Roman world. So he was from the area that's now Bulgaria. So he comes from a place called Sardica. And he was a cavalry soldier. The Thracians, which is the group of people he belonged to, they were renowned for their cavalry, and the Romans loved the cavalry soldiers from Thrace and would often include them in their kind of military in a different ways. So he's a great example of how kind of movement in the Roman world. So he started life in Bulgaria and ended his days in Colchester. And then we have Marcus Favonius Facilis, who is a very traditional Roman person with three names. He is from the Polliner tribe, so he's from a voting tribe. So it says on the tombstone kind of who he's connected to. And this was set up by his freedman, Vercundus and Navicus. So clearly, again, this is kind of very reflective of Roman society and the Roman world at that time and the things that were going on. Both of those tombstones actually date to just before the Boudiccan destruction of the town. And the reason they survived so well is that they were basically knocked down during Boudicca's attack on the town. So they were kind of left face down in the ground, and they were able to be preserved that way for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. And then finally, we have some more fragmentary examples. So again, we have a cavalry soldier, this time only sadly lived to 20 years old, reference to a wife, and yeah, the kind of the people. It's all as I know. I'm sure all of you will know this. The kind of Roman funerary inscriptions have these traditional formulae that you follow. That you kind of say name, age, given by, etc., etc. So even though we have fragments, sometimes they kind of still show the format was being followed here in Colchester. Food and drink. So we have a lovely fragment of a Falernian wine vessel. Falernian wine was one of the most expensive wines in the Roman world. We know that from historical sources. And we know that from, there's an inscription from a tavern in Pompeii, I believe, where it shows the prices of wine, and Falernian was the most expensive you could pay for at that time. And then this is more of an enigmatic one. So this is a bit of graffiti on a vessel, and it says Enna Venus. Now, that's not really a word. I'm not really sure if that is what it says. It may have been reconstructed to say to read kind of something else, because as you can see, the pottery is in fragments. But one possible interpretation, it's very similar to nervous, I think, I can't remember, but it's other words that could mean weak or feeble. Maybe this was alcohol, maybe this was a drink intended to make you feel weak or feeble, maybe it was poison, maybe it was something kind of connected to that. But this is a typical kind of drink or food container. So someone has made the effort to scratch this onto the side. A bit like standardization of English, people would have been writing and not really known proper spellings of certain words. And so you do find a lot of words that are spelt similar but different to words that we know of Latin today. So yeah, it could be a whole host of different things, but it's a bit of a mystery to us what it actually was meant to say. We have medical objects. So these are both oculist stamps. So these were used to stamp eye medicine for people. So we have basically the names of the doctor that are on these stamps. So we have Publius Claudius Primus, and we have Marshal someone. So again, we can't really read sometimes. This one's not broken, it's just a bit poorly made. So it's not really clear what the full inscription reads as, but it tells us the doctors basically who were prescribing this medicine. Personal property, this one's one of my favorites. It's a knife handle that says Flamma Senevari, the flame of Senevarus. So clearly this is a person's personal object and they didn't want anyone else taking it. So they inscribed their name on the handle of this object. Then we have souvenirs. So the Colchester vase, again, I could do a whole another talk on this, but the Colchester vase is one of our most iconic objects. It shows gladiators fighting and beast fights and a beast hunt. But what's unique about it is it has the names of those people on it, which is the only example of its kind in Britain. So these are named people who would have been fighting in Britain in the 2nd century. This was made. So we have Secundus, Mario, who were the 2 people taming a bear, and then we have Memnon and Valentinus. So Memnon, there's the English one. There we go. So Memnon was the secutor, and Valentinus is the winner in this bout, and he has. I think he was the winner. Yeah. Yeah. So Memnon has won 9 times. And Valentinus was part of the 30th Legion before becoming gladiator. So it's quite an interesting, unique object that kind of, especially considering, as I said, we haven't found an amphitheatre here in Colchester. We have this object that tells that there were some gladiators and they have names that were fighting nearby, because there's been recent studies of the vessel, and the vessel was definitely made in or near Colchester. So it's very much a local object. So we have some evidence for this activity happening, even if we don't have the amphitheatre. Then we have things like tokens. So yeah, the one on the left says Paratus, ready. And this one, which has a tiny, tiny little X on it, which I didn't think, I found on our records that there was a token with an X on it. I was pouring through our tokens because I didn't think this was definitely the one. But when you get the lighting right, you can see there is a tiny scratch of an X. Now, whether this was intentional, whether this is accidental, probably was intentional because it's quite distinct. But the meaning of which we don't know. We have quite a few tokens with numerals written on them. That might have been scorekeeping. It might have been kind of part of the game. We're just not really sure. And then we have names of people who made things. So on the left, we have Greek, which is very rare in Britain. We have Eutychus, who was probably the person who made the intaglio. But maybe it was the person that owned it. We don't know, because again, this is kind of scratched on. It's not very well done, so we're not really sure who kind of inscribed it. And then this Samian ware, lots of Samian ware stamped with the name of the person that made it. That was quite a typical thing to do. So this was made by someone called Aquitanus. So that's quite common. And we have lots of Samian stamps showing a whole range of different names. And there's a whole database of names of Samian ware makers that you can look at, and shows where they came from and all that kind of thing, which is really interesting. So just to end, with a few minutes to spare before we have any questions, I just thought I'd end just pointing you towards, as teachers, we do have some useful resources on our website. If you want to find out more, this was very much a whistle-stop tour of Colchester's history, and I know I've missed out on a lot of things that I probably could have and should have talked about. But we have collections online, which you can see on the left, where you can look at all sorts of different subjects, not just Roman stuff, all sorts of different things. And we have resources for teachers that have been created at all sorts of different levels to kind of help teach within the classroom. And then the final thing is a thank you and a bit of a teaser. So this summer we have our Mythical Creatures exhibition coming to Colchester Castle, which does touch upon the Romans, even though it's sort of more of a medieval theme. We do have Roman mythology and Roman objects in that exhibition. And as a personal plug, I have a book coming out next month, which does feature the Romans quite heavily, which is 50 LGBTQ plus fines, which looks at objects found by members of the public, so archaeological objects that have been found by the public, and uses those objects to tell stories of the history of LGBTQ plus history and culture, from the bisexual escapades of Mercury to kind of giraffes and sheep in the modern day, and understanding sexuality and sex and gender through a whole host of different lenses. So yeah, I will end there and we will see if there are any questions.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. That was really interesting. It's really great to hear about, Britain before the Romans. And yeah, I had no idea about there's no portraiture or imagery of these people, because you see so much Roman sculpture, you kind of forget just a whole lack of that.
Yeah. You have a
Um,
bit in the continent. You do get some Iron Age imagery in the continent, but there's not really a lot in Britain. It's more figurative kind of art and things like that.
yeah. And yeah, so much useful content for chapters 7 to 10 of Tiburani. So I think really great for these teachers here. And definitely would love to have you back to talk about the Fenwick treasure or Colchester vase at some point. I've got some questions in the chat, so we'll start with those. I've got a few questions from Jay Alderson. So she says, in comparison with London, before the Romans arrived, how much bigger or smaller was Colchester? And does this influence why we think the Romans chose Colchester initially as its admin capital?
Yeah, so London was kind of like a handful of buildings. It wasn't, and I say buildings loosely, this was the Iron Age, so against roundhouses. So London had kind of a few roundhouses along the Thames in what is now City of London, which would then become the Roman town. And as I said, Colchester was an established town. It was a big, what we call it an oppida. So those late Iron Age big fortified towns, oppida. There was one in the area that we think is now called Gosbecks. And that's why they kind of headed here, partly because that was the capital of the region. Again, it's a bit like with the Boudiccan story. There's kind of various reasons of the Roman conquest that kind of are given. One is kind of rescuing a local prince who had kind of lost his territory, and the Romans were coming to help reclaim his land. Some is kind of just that kind of, I think in the kind of modern public mentality, it's this idea of Claudius wanting to prove himself as a young kind of new emperor, and every other emperor had done something to prove themselves. So his thing would be conquering Britain. So he just decided that would be the thing to do. But whatever the reason, Colchester was arguably the nearest big settlement to the continent. So whatever way they came, this is the other thing, the landing point of the Romans is often hotly debated. Whether it was Fishbourne, a lot of people think Fishbourne was where they first landed. Some people think it was Colchester, that they just came straight up along the coast and came into Colchester. But whatever it is, they headed here because it was a well-established town. And as we've seen with the burial practices, they were already trading here. So a lot of the Romans would have known where Colchester was, would have known the people. So it was an easy route in, really.
Great. And following up from that, there's someone asking, what was the Iron Age settlement called before the Romans arrived? And is that linked to Camulodunum? And what is the origin of that Roman name?
So the Romans changed it drastically to Camulodunum from Camulodunon. So they just changed the ending because it needed to fit Latin declension, I guess. So they had to change the ending. Well, they didn't have to, but they did. And it's believed that the name means kind of city of Camulos. So they think Camulus was a war god within Iron Age religious kind of belief. Or fortress, I think, rather than city. It's kind of fortress of Camulos. So that's what Camulodunon supposedly means.
And then do we know whether the locals after the Boudiccan revolt were able to access administrative civic roles in society, and were there few or many?
I think so, yeah. So as I said, kind of after Boudicca destroyed the town, Colchester flourished. All of those things that you saw, the theatres, the kind of the forum, all those public buildings were like the temple of Claudius. This was the other thing. The temple of Claudius was destroyed in the Boudiccan destruction, but was rebuilt. So the temple we have, the foundation of the temple we have today, they survived the initial Boudiccan destruction. And what was above the surface, the columns and the celler and all that kind of stuff, they rebuilt that from the building materials of the destroyed town. Um, so yeah, it thrived. People would have had administrative roles. They would have had it, again. It was the capital still after Boudicca's destruction of the town. It was a few decades before London would become the capital, so it still had a little bit of time being this important central hub for Britain. So yeah, and then even after London became a capital, it was clearly still an important place, and there would have been people with important roles here.
We've also got lots of people just saying thank you for a fascinating
Yeah,
talk and for
that's
your
great. Thank
online
you.
resources. I got a question. Are there any archaeological finds relating to Druids?
So as I said, there's the supposed Druid's grave. I do appreciate. I did see some people joining partway through, so you may have missed some of the things earlier on. But there is the Doctor's grave, also known as the Druid's grave. Um, I don't know whether it is a Druid. Again, Druids archaeologically, there's not really a like. How do you spot a Druid? How would you know someone was a Druid? It's hard. It's hard to say. So not really. It's mainly historical sources that we have to understand the
Mm.
Druids. But yeah, the closest we get is that grave where it has those medical healing objects alongside those religious objects. But like I say, they're all very Roman, so that person was clearly highly influenced by the Romans. And from what we understand of the Druids by the Romans, Druids wouldn't be doing that. So it's hard to it's hard to know for certain who that person was.
Um, there's time for a few more questions if anyone has. Oh, here's one. If not by the presence of a basilica, by what finds was the forum in Colchester identified?
Well, I mean, again, like I said, from the photo, the excavations happened. I think it must have been in the 30s, maybe a bit later.
Mhm.
But I'm not really sure. I think just the material culture that was found in that area. So again, things like amphorae, vessels, and things that you would have found coinage that would have been found in that area. Large open space, because that's what
Mm.
forum was, with peripheral buildings would have been the best indicator that that was a forum, because most Roman towns didn't have large open spaces unless it was a forum. So I think
Mm.
it's that one of those weird things is in that the absence of something proves the existence of something.
Yeah.
So the fact that it was a large area where they didn't find many buildings, but they had them around the edges, I think that's what suggested that it was a forum.
Okay. And I've got a question myself. I just wanted to ask about, you're talking about the kind of recent excavations. I was wondering, are there any recent finds or are there any things that people are hoping to find? Can we expect anything?
Yeah, yeah, there's always ongoing. So Colchester Archaeological Trust still operate. They are always excavating the town. It's not always Roman.
Mhm.
Uh, understandably, Colchester has been around for more than 2,000 years. So there's a big site, what used to be Colchester Hospital, that was excavated thoroughly, and we're starting to get some of that material into the museum, because this is the other thing, a lot of excavations, the stuff does come to us in the end. Um, Nothing outstanding, sadly. I mean,
No?
all archaeology is interesting because it tells us the day-to-day life of individuals. It's more Samian ware, more pottery, more
Mhm.
all that kind of usual stuff. For me, like the most exciting thing I know of that came from an excavation was a couple of years ago. They're excavating a site on Queen Street, which used to be a theatre, and it burnt down. I can't remember. I think it was in the 1800s. It burnt down, and they found a burnt violin and sheet music in the excavations, which was like incredible because the
Wow.
organic material doesn't survive really. And although that's more recent history, even a couple of hundred years, it's highly unlikely for something like that to survive. But the fact they found that at these excavations, and obviously it's very directly linked to this theatre being there at that time. I thought that was an incredible find.
Yeah. And then Vivian has said she'd be interested to know more about the virtual tour of Colchester being made.
Yeah, so I mean, there's quite a few things with that. I'm not sure which one they're referring to necessarily.
Mm.
We do already have a sort of virtual tour of Colchester Castle that we created during the pandemic, when schools couldn't visit, that you can still access, which kind of takes you on a tour down into the vaults where the temple foundations were, and talks through some of the bits about the Boudiccan destruction of the town, things like that. We are expanding on that and doing a wider castle tour, virtual tour, relating to kind of the wider history of Colchester. There's also a project we're working on, which has created a virtual tour, which is looking at diversity in the Roman world. So a bit like I was talking about Longinus and coming from Bulgaria and stuff like that, looking at what evidence we have in Colchester for people coming from other parts of the empire, and kind of trade and things like that. And specifically kind of this notion of what the Romans were, and Romanness being something that's quite broad, and actually no two Romans would have looked the same. They came from all sorts of different backgrounds: North Africa, Near East, Italy, Greece, Spain, wherever. And so Romans were very diverse people. So it's kind of exploring that a little bit through a virtual tour where we've worked with the Mercury Theatre to create kind of these short videos when you go around the tour that tell you about each of these different objects that can tell that story. So hopefully it was one of those that you were asking
Well, they
about.
all sound very interesting.
But yeah, they'll be, I mean, look at our website. There's always going to be updates of kind of new things that we're working on in our learning section.
Well, I think, I mean, it's perfectly on 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for being here for such an interesting talk. And thank you to everyone else for joining us tonight. And I think, yeah, have a great evening, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Ben. That was really interesting. And
That's all right.
thanks
Thank
for your time, thanks for your evening.
No, it's been a pleasure. And like I say, I'm happy to do kind of other subjects if they're of interest. And I know I think my manager was kind of, because he's been leading on the Gladiators exhibition, kind of said about possibly doing something about gladiators, but I don't know if that he actually got in touch with you, or I might chase that, because
Okay.
I'm sure
Yeah,
he
I think he
said
was
he's
in
happy
touch
to
with
do
my
it.
colleague. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, always welcome back.
Thank you.
Virtually or anywhere in conferences, yeah. And yeah, good luck for your book and for all your upcoming exhibitions. And yeah, hopefully we can see you soon. And
Yeah, I'll be in touch.
okay,
Bye bye.
brilliant. Thank you so much.